Hello, welcome to the video for what is the apply and receive radial damage nodes. I've gone ahead and created this quick little example here. If I shoot this box on the left, we're going to go ahead and lose some health every time I shoot it. If I shoot the box on the right, we are going to go ahead and see it destruct, and actually if I shoot it again, we're going to see a little bit of movement from the inside. Now this is using our damage apply radial damage node as well as our receive radial damage nodes. We're going to go ahead and cover what they do. These first three nodes here in our example, we can go ahead and ignore. This is me pushing the left button, doing a line trace forward, and then seeing what I hit. For our example, we're going to use those hit results, feed it into our node, and then do something with them. So let's cover what they do. Now for an apply radial damage, only one of these nodes is going to be required, and that's going to be our origin. Where did this damage start from? Radial damage is basically from the origin point going out in a circle, a complete circle, a sphere. It's going to apply damage inside of that sphere. Now, a radial damage node is different than the radial damage with fall off. The difference between the two of them is the radial damage applies the full damage basically inside of the radius for the most part. And the radial damage with fall off tapers the damage off as you get closer and closer to the edge with configurable settings. So the radial damage, once we pass along the origin, which I'm using for our impact point, it has your base damage. Basically, this is the damage that's applied at the origin. Then you have your damage radius. How far out does the damage go? And in our case, it's going to be 300. If you find that your radial damage doesn't work when you're trying to use it, check that you actually have a radius, because by default this is going to be 0. Under that we have our damage type class. This is a normal damage type. You can set it to none, which is our default, or a custom one, which we'll do here in a second. Ignore actors is an array of actors that will ignore this damage when it happens. So, for example, if you want your walls to ignore this specific type of damage, or you want scenery, you can add them to ignore actors. Now we have our damage causer and our damage are instigated by controller. Damage causer is what did the damage. In the case, it could be a grenade fired from a grenade launcher. Instigated is basically what caused the damage to happen. What caused the causer is more appropriate. So for example, the player, controller, threw the grenade which caused the damage. So that's what these two are for. They're completely optional. You just simply pass them along. You have do full damage. Basically, this means that it will do the full damage no matter what. It's not obstructed by any obstacles and such. And then you have your damage prevention channel. Basically, you can set this to a custom type, or by default, it's visibility. The only things that are visible will be damaged. If it's invisible, it won't be damaged. And it's the same thing with all these other ones. So if you wanted, for example, only certain things to be affected by radial damage, like a scenery, then you would want to make sure you have a custom channel for that. Now for our radial damage with fall off, you're going to find it's the same, except you have a few extra inputs. Minimum damage, this is the minimum amount of damage it's going to do. So if you wanted a base damage of, let's say, 100, but you always wanted them to take 25, even if they're at the maximum range, you would set your minimum damage to 25. Now you have your inner radius and your outer radius. Basically, the inner radius is the radius of the full damage area. So you could have the inner 10% be full damage, and then the outer 90% be a slowly decreasing amount of damage. Damage outer radius is basically it's basically the same as this, your damage radius, but it's your outside sphere, and it's going to determine where the minimum damage is at. And then you have your damage fall off, which basically is an exponent. 1 is going to be an even damage amount, and a higher than 1 is basically going to stagger your breakdown in terms of how smooth your fall off is going to be. Your other ones here are the same on your apply radial damage. So let's go ahead and see how this works. Inside of our dummy box, I actually have any damage hooked up. Any damage is any damage. a radial damage, point damage, or just generic damage will fire the any damage event. If I was to hook up the radial damage event as well, and we go ahead and hit play, we're going to find two events when I fire. Health going down from our any damage event, and then health going down along with our hit location from the radial damage event. So let's go and unhook our any damage event, and I'll go ahead and show you how to get access to the nodes. So because these are pawns, you can override the built-in functions, and that's where you'll find any damage, that's where you'll find radial damage, and that's where you'll find point damage. So for example, if I wanted to do the radial damage, I could type in properly spelled radial damage, and we'll find the add event radial damage. If we go ahead and hook this up, for my example, we're going to go ahead and apply that radial damage. Now, radial damage really only passes along one extra pin here, two extra pins technically. For the event, it's the hit info, which is our entire hit result. Okay, there we go, which is our entire hit result from our line trace. And then it's also the origin, which we passed along right here. So, radial damage itself, like I said, it radiates from the beginning. And in terms of usage, you're going to find a few different things. So let's say, right now, in our example, when we fire it here, we're taking damage. And if you notice, I'm taking 100 points of damage. But depending on where I'm firing at, we're going to take less and less damage. See, now it's nothing. Then as I get closer, 340, and then basically it falls off because we're farther away from our damage point. You'll also notice the number on the bottom, and that's because I have a damage node hooked up, and basically I'm taking a little bit of fall off damage from the radius. Now in terms of our destructible mesh, you're going to find a couple things here. The destructible mesh, when it hits this impact point right here, it's going to radiate out and then apply force. So when we fire here, you'll notice this one pushing to the right. You'll notice even though I can fire and not hit it, it's going to go ahead and push outwards. Now if you notice it's not pushing much, it is not determined by the base damage how much a destructible mesh is pushed by a radial damage. That is determined by your damage type. If I change this over to an explosion damage type and I hit play, we're going to see some slightly different things. We're going to see that happen, but we're also going to see a tremendously large amount of explosion when I fire. We also see our little box here. We also see it fly off into space. Well, using your damage types, you have the rigid body, which is affecting my box on the left, and the destruction variables. Damage impulse and radial damage velocity change. Basically, when I hit the ground here, it's applying a force, giving velocity to anything it can hit, and then because that is a physical item, it's pushing it away from the source. If I run that again, we fire here, for example, it's going to push it to our left. So that's a good use for the radial damage. In terms of the right, in terms of this, that's going to be our second point, the destructible impulse and the destructible damage spread. If we make this a nice happy 4,000 number, and we hit play, we're going to see a nice, remember the impact point is on the surface here when we hit. That's why it shatters like that. Now that we can fire inside of here, that is why we see our explosion out everywhere. So that is something to keep in mind. Remember, we're hitting the surface, and then we're hitting inside, and that's why we get our explosion. So if you actually want a destructible mesh to be affected more physically, it's not the amount of damage you do, it's the amount of impulse and the fall-off spread inside of your actual damage type. The damage passed along to a destructible mesh simply determines whether or not you can destroy it based on how much damage that destructible mesh takes. So far in our example, our destructible mesh here only takes 1 point of damage. Therefore, as long as we're doing 1 point of damage, we'll be fine. If we change this to 0.5, for example, and hit play, you're going to find we can't even destroy the mesh because we're not doing enough damage. we can still blow that out of the water because we are applying impulse damage to a rigid body. So that is what our apply radial damage and receive radial damage nodes are for. They're used to mimic an explosion from a central point. They have fall-off damage if you want to use the fall-off version. And destructible meshes are affected naturally without even having any damage nodes inside of them. It's just the way destructible meshes work. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below.